Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jack Peterson. I'm NACo's Director of Strategic Relations, and I'm very excited and pleased to have our partners at Tidal Basin here for today's webinar. This group of great experts, they've been NACo partners for quite a while, and they're going to talk through how to sort of look at and think about all the various federal funding streams, grant management opportunities that are out in the world. We know many of you have received, all of you have received direct ARPA funds, but we also know many different federal agencies have their sort of regularly scheduled grants and different funding opportunities, as well as new COVID-related funding streams as well. So I'm very pleased to have a couple of great experts with us today from the Tidal Basin team. We've got Mark Mizak and Alan Davis. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to them. We will have a Q&A opportunity at the end. So we hope you'll put your questions in the chat, send your questions in to the moderators, and we'll get those answered and elevated. So Mark, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thanks so much again for being here.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Many thanks to NACo for having us. We always look forward to collaborating with NACo on sessions related to federal funding streams and how to navigate those streams. The world of federal funding has evolved in many ways since the onset of COVID-19 and continues to develop as financial impacts and programs to address those impacts are set up and stood up around the country. So it's important to stay current on all things related to federal funding, specifically the importance of developing a grants management strategy. So our team at Tidal Basin recognizes the challenges that counties may face while navigating these waters. And like I said, the world of federal funding is ever changing. So our goal in the session today and in general is to help counties and local communities nationwide understand the funding and how to develop a grant management plan, ultimately to make sure that at the end you're able to remain compliant with all the various sets of guidance that are out there, as well as to maximize the type of funding that's available to you. So today, my colleague Alan Davis and I will do our best to arm you with resources needed to navigate the funding allocations that are available to incorporate into or develop a grant management plan for your community. So a little bit about Alan. Alan is our Director of Recovery. He has 12 years experience in managing major disaster recovery operations with FEMA's PA program. He's also served as a PA group supervisor, assisted in the redesign of PA program and grants portal manager, and he's also authorized, or actually helped author the sections of the Papa G guidance. So those of you who are familiar with FEMA public assistance, the collection of policies that manage that is referred to as the Papa G. So infrastructure, SEM, subject matter expert as well on the catastrophic planning team. So he's got a wealth of knowledge to bring to this conversation, and has certainly worked with communities that are dealing with large groups of funds that are either incoming or to some degree in progress. So I'll introduce myself a little bit as well. I'm Mark Mizak. I've been doing disaster recovery work and leadership for about 30 years, maybe a little bit more than 30 years now. About 23 and a half of those were with FEMA, leading some of their most complex recovery operations. So I have been in most of the major disasters that you could name that have occurred over the last 2 or 3 decades, assuming a variety of roles in those specific disasters. I've spent about the last 8 years in the consulting side of things, working with state level clients, county level clients, and even providing guidance to nation states on how they would actually put together response and recovery frameworks, as well as strategies for them to address what they need to get addressed immediately following or prior to a disaster. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and move forward in the slide deck and make sure that we've covered our agenda. So it's imperative that we continue the discussion of COVID-19 while we prepare for the next disaster, not knowing what it's going to be. But many of the tenets of a good grants management strategy will keep you in the right place, not respective to what the particular hazard or disaster is that you're facing. So, we're going to try, we'll use poignant examples from things that have happened recently or things that are going on now. But we'll, also allude to things where, how flexible this can be as we consider what these principles apply to unknown type events. So we're going to review a few things today to help counties understand and utilize a grants management plan. So Al and I are going to review the importance of a grants management strategy, where to start when developing a grants management plan, and how to map a grants management plan. So I encourage all of you to submit questions through the Q&A box as we move forward. We will be answering the questions live, through the chat function on your screens, and we'll address some of the questions live verbally. And any that we can't get to, we'll certainly get to at the completion of today's discussion. And then all the Q&As will be available as a resource to all of you as well. So they'll be made available, through NACo, and I'm sure there'll be a link that'll be posted for you to get to those. We'll also post them on the Tidal Basin site as well in the next day or two. So you'll have a couple of sources to get back to those. So let's talk first. Let's move to the next slide and let's talk about the importance of a grants management strategy. So without a grants management strategy, you're leaving yourself open and susceptible to disallowance down the road, considering how long the tails on grants are. So some grants, have a very specific ending time frame for the expenditure of the money, but that's not really the expenditure to make sure that things are completely closed. Closeout activities can take quite a bit longer depending on how the grant money was provided to the county, whether it was direct from a federal source or whether it was provided as a sub-grantee, through the state. As well, one of the other things that, I would just say on the disallowance issue is the Inspector General, that goes in and evaluates the use of the funds. They have a number of years in most cases to come back in, even after a grant is financially closed. So, some of the things that we're going to do is make sure that we talk about, the preservation of flexibility, how to avoid those types of disallowances, maximize your opportunities, and the flexibility and the cost tracking mechanisms. So I'm going to start to spend a little time on each of those now, but I just felt it was important. If you were to, as an example, read any annual IG report that comes out about disaster streams of funding in particular. This could be, from HUD, from Homeland Security's IG, related to FEMA, could be from transportation or a number of other locations. On any of their top 10 lists of things that occur every year where they're advising potential recipients of the funding how to avoid getting money disallowed or clawed back. The big things on there are related to procurement. That's the number one reason across the board if you aggregate it. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on that and how doing that right also grants you some additional flexibility. So let's talk about that flexibility. So with the procurement guidance as the first item to discuss. So it's important to look at a unified set of procurement guidance. What I mean by that is procurement guidance that's not specific to one grant or funding source. So whenever you get into things where there's a potential crossover or an allowance to combine funds, whether it's for the purpose of meeting your cost match under a different grant program or whatever the case may be, you've preserved the greatest flexibility. So the example here is, disaster happens and as far as federal agencies go, FEMA is usually one of the first to arrive. They've provided you in the kickoff meeting or through their counterpart with the state that you work with. They've provided you with their procurement guidance. And then they tell you, use our procurement guidance or your local procurement guidance, whichever one is more restrictive. And so you feel there's a merging of this procurement guidance and you move forward on your happy way. And then later, whenever an annual appropriation comes out from Congress having to do with block grant DR funds, you find out that there's a possibility that you could actually meet the cost match that you have, at the county level with funds that come out of the block grant DR pot of money. But you go back and you look, and you've already let most of your contracts for the work that you need to do following a disaster. Challenge is that if those contracts were not also let with consideration for Davis-Bacon Act and prevailing wage rates and other things that are part of the riders whenever you use HUD funding, your contracts may not be fully compliant, and you may not be able to apply cost match from block grant to those. That doesn't mean you lose the block grant money, but it does mean that's one less opportunity that might be available to you. So, having an idea of, what are the grant sources of grant funding that are most likely, and putting together a singular, grant procurement guidance to all the agencies that have contracting authority in your county is highly helpful and highly advantageous, especially because recovery from larger events takes years, and COVID-19 is no exception. So let's also talk a little bit about disallowance and avoidance of that disallowance, sometimes referred to as clawback. So essentially, we advise you to start with a good and healthy documentation strategy, as well as that unified procurement guidance and processes. On the documentation strategy, it starts with some very basic things that you might be able to put in place on the cost tracking side. But ultimately, you want to be able to tell your story from the county level, not dependent on who's still there working at the county whenever somebody comes to ask those questions. Keeping in mind, this could be 5 years later. So one of the things that, I would specifically say is, documentation strategy about what you intend to collect, where it'll be housed, in a place where everybody who plays a role understands that's part of their disaster role, is to put that information in the place where it goes, is certainly going to save you a lot of headache as you move forward. So maximizing opportunities. We said we would talk a little bit about that more, and we'll certainly get into some more examples later in the presentation, but we want to ensure that your county is taking advantage of all the available opportunities. So a few things to keep in mind, and to start with, ask yourself the questions: what programs does your county currently pursue? So what programs do you have and do you receive funding for that could be already applicable? And what programs does your county want to pursue? What are those things that you're attempting to solve? Second tier to that is to come in and ask yourself the question about what funds are specifically earmarked for a given purpose, and are those funds enough, or do you need to augment them with one of the new lines of funding? Or what set of funding is essentially competitive versus non-competitive. So at times you'll see that there were things that were out very specifically after COVID-19 that could have been paid for, with ARPA money, or could have been paid for under FEMA. And so the question to ask yourself is, if one of those is a limited pool of money that, may not be coming again, and is flexible as to how you get to program it, and the other one is specifically what it is that's eligible, if you can perform the documentation requirements, ending up with a stronger recovery probably means being able to line out the difference of, first exhausting everything that was non-competitive or, non-programmable, and then filling in where you want to put the rest of that grant money based on those first two questions that you asked yourself about: what programs do you currently pursue, right, and to what volume, and what programs does your county want to pursue? So let's go to the last point that I'm going to make before I turn it over to Alan. So this is specifically flexibility and cost tracking mechanisms. Implementing cost tracking mechanisms that work across all grant programs, is key. And these are things that you can actually make progress on in a blue sky day. So, right, typical, manners of tracking, your system should be configurable to allow space for different sources of funding. The example might be, if you have parks and recreation staff that during a time of a disaster, you're going to assign them to sandbagging, or you're going to, ask them to do some other kind of work, or maybe you have county staff that have been put on work not related to what they normally do at all, because they're assisting in health and wellness checks as a result of COVID-19, or helping, to direct, let's just say, traffic to their offices in a different way, to be able to accomplish their county tasks. You probably would want to have a way to say what specific tasks were things that were additional costs incurred as a result of that emergency. So your timekeeping systems, a lot of timekeeping systems these days, more modern, or flexible enough to just enter a new code. That's something that you probably want to have established, so that, whenever the bell goes off, you've got that capability. If you don't have it now, it's not usually a very tall order to have the option to have a programmable code put in to whatever existing timekeeping system you use in whatever, annual or biannual update that you do. So, but those kinds of things are important, and something that we have seen work time and time again, especially, across events that, were not fully expected. The first thing is you're going to start meeting however you need to meet the goals for the community that you serve. But if you don't have a system ready to start tracking what that level of effort is, sometimes it's difficult or more time consuming than it is worth it to go back and try and capture. So it's important to have the step included, and minimize that time. So with that, I'd like to have us move into the funding and eligibility and allowable uses. So I'd like to move this part of the conversation over to Alan. So Alan.
Thanks, Mark. So next, I'm going to talk about how to design a grants management strategy that is not endemic to any one funding program. So we're not just talking about public assistance or just talking about HMGP or CDBG or anything like that. We want to talk about the strategies you can implement as an organization that will support any grant program that you want to participate in. So, I suspect we've all been through and participate in FEMA's public assistance program. It's where a lot of our work as grants management experts lives. So I'll use that as a parallel, as well as give some examples as to how we have helped some of our clients look at sort of the whole landscape in terms of all of the different available programs and how they work together if we develop a really thorough grants management strategy. So, as Mark mentioned, not all grants are earmarked funds. Some of them are competitive. Some are set aside, as well as, so a well thought out grants management strategy will prepare you to both compete for dollars as well as to maximize earmarked funds. So we do that by suggesting that we look at everything that your county intends to participate in or currently participates in and create some sort of funding or eligibility matrix. So we look at where these programs may intersect with one another and determine where the path of least resistance is, what may be administratively less cumbersome. We all know the FEMA PA program, especially for this COVID disaster, has been very challenging, and there are alternatives to that. But at the same time, we want to look at avoiding duplication of benefits, but at the same time, we don't want to leave anything on the table. So if there are any gaps between what your county needs and what it currently receives, maybe we look at other outside funding programs that you haven't considered and tap into those programs to make sure that your community is served to the best extent that you can. But by having a thorough grants management strategy, it empowers your county to take advantage of whatever programs may become available, the programs you already participate in, and anything that may pop up out of nowhere, like ARPA or the CARES Act. We didn't get much runway to prepare for those programs, so we sort of had to learn them on the fly. But with a really good strategy in place, it really maximizes our ability to take advantage of them. So some things to consider are timing. Certain programs have a very short window, such as the HMGP program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is not necessarily disaster specific, it's competitive. And oftentimes a lot of HMGP money gets returned simply because the folks who would like to use it can't meet the requirements on time, or they're unprepared, or their hazard mitigation plans aren't in such a format that they can take advantage of and submit the LOIs and pursue that money in time. There are also cost share requirements for certain programs. So the FEMA PA program is a good example. Oftentimes we see a 75% federal cost share most of the time. Sometimes states have a state cost share that they will provide, and almost always there's a local cost share. For COVID-19, it's 100%, so that's a consideration. So when we build these plans, we want to think about what the investment is for your county in terms of whether or not we want to take advantage of one program or another. Another thing to consider is the administrative burden. So good example, again, is the FEMA PA program. It's been very, very challenging. Now there is a management cost allowance. I think it's 5% of the aggregate eligible cost that can be spent on the administrative effort in administering the program, but it's certainly a consideration because there sometimes are programs that are a little easier to manage and take less of your time. We all wear many hats, I'm sure, within these county departments, and the disaster world is sort of your side job, but when when disaster strikes or we're getting into grants management, it becomes your full-time job. Some of our counties aren't lucky enough to have full-time grants managers, so considering the administrative burden is really an important thing to think about. Some programs are reimbursement based, like the PA program, and other programs are not, and allow you to invest that money into the community without having to replace something that you spent previously, like the PA program. Other programs are more flexible, and again, it's really important to map out exactly what programs you currently participate in and what you would like to participate in to develop a thorough strategy. So where do we start? Good question. So like Mark mentioned, what programs does your county currently participate in? I would guess that almost everybody on this call participates in FEMA's PA program. As unfortunate as it is, as the need to participate in that program may be, it's a really good program. It's not always the fastest, but it's generally available when these large-scale disasters strike. I know there's already one for the Orange County oil spill that occurred over the weekend. There's a request to the White House already, I think, has been sent. They've asked for a major declaration, so I would suspect if it meets all the criteria, that program will be turned on very quickly. So it has a lot of flexibility. So what programs do we participate in? Is it FEMA, the PA program? Is it CDBG? Is it the FHWA program, if that ever gets turned on? And do we have a plan in place that may support all of these different types of programs from both an administrative standpoint as well as a monitoring standpoint, and all the other administrative things that come along with that. So the first thing that we like to suggest is that we identify the key roles in the grants management process by role and department, not necessarily by individual. So oftentimes we see a really long tail on these types of grants. The PA program, for example, sometimes takes decades to close out. I personally signed the last closeout project for the Northridge earthquake in 2011. That's 17 years after the disaster occurred. So the likelihood of the same people being in the same roles 17 years later is usually pretty low, unless your agency has extremely low turnover. So we like to talk about who within your organizations by department and by specific role should be involved in the grants management process. So a lot of times we see a variety of folks from accounting and finance, contracting, engineering, public works, parks and rec, solid waste, water and sewer, and maybe a legal person. You would be surprised at how siloed some counties are. Oftentimes, leaders, people in leadership positions aren't even aware of the various grant programs that your county may participate in. So we like to look at it as a comprehensive approach because it takes effort across your county's departments to really maximize and be thorough in your grants management processes. Also worthwhile considering what community stakeholders you might want to engage and to involve in your grants management process. Maybe that's a local regulatory organization, maybe it's a permitting organization. Really important to implement spending tracking mechanisms that, again, aren't endemic to one program or another, because at the end of the day, these grants have to be monitored and reported and closed out at some point. And at any point during that process, you may be audited by the state or the IG. So having all of your ducks in a row from a cost tracking, spending tracking mechanism is a really good idea. It's also important to implement a mechanism to track physical work. So, oftentimes we apply for and secure these grants, whether it's PA, HMGP, or otherwise. The money comes in, we've got the green light to start, we let the contracts, and then things change. So we make sure that you develop a process internally to monitor the actual project, which means we really need to lean on those departmental roles, those key departmental folks, to report back and say, hey, we had to let a change order or execute a change order on this particular contract because we ran into some environmental issues. Because at the end of the day, the issuing agency, the agency responsible for that grant, whether it's FEMA or HUD or the Federal Highway Administration, they're going to want to know. Because if there's federal dollars attached to it, we have to monitor any changes that may happen in the scope of work, because there could be impacts on Section 106 or the environmental and historic rules that come along with these projects. And again, as Mark mentioned, how do we store our documentation? Where do we put it? Do we store it physically in a warehouse somewhere? Do we keep everything electronically, which I hope is the case? And do we have a system to back that up? I can't tell you how many times I ran into closeouts during my time at FEMA, where the warehouse that stored the records flooded or caught on fire, and we literally don't have anything to support these grants. And it really puts you in a really tough spot if that's the only place you ever kept your records. So it's really important to have a backup plan. Store this stuff electronically. It's incredibly easy these days to store electronic records in lieu of old paper records, as we have in the past. And then the last thing to consider is implementing a mechanism to monitor all the various timelines that may come into play. So let's think about it in a logical progression. So we've identified the programs we participate in currently, the programs we would like to participate in. We've assessed what the potential eligibility of those, what types of projects might be eligible under those programs. Now let's think about what the timelines are for each one of those programs. So when we say timelines, we mean we have a finite amount of time to spend the money. We have to submit regular reports, so quarterly progress reports or the interim report for ARPA, since we're probably all going through that now. Are we a non-entitlement unit? Do we have to participate in all of the reporting requirements? Or what specifically applies to us? I always like to suggest a calendar with timeline specific events for each one of your projects under each grant program. That way you don't miss out on anything. I can't tell you how many times we get to close out and we see an applicant that didn't submit a time extension on time, and FEMA or the state or the IG recommends disallowance simply because there isn't a piece of paper that said, hey, we need a little bit of extra time to complete this project. So when we look at all these potential issues, you start to see where there's a common thread across all of these grant programs. And so when we develop these strategies, again, we don't want to look at just FEMA's PA requirements. We don't want to look at just the ARPA requirements or HMGP requirements. We want to look at implementing a strategy that says we will look at all of these things and make a plan to manage each program specifically. And again, to Mark's point, when we develop these strategies, let's take a look backwards and say, what issues have we run into in the past? Have we been challenged by the IG? Has FEMA disallowed any of the expenses we've asked for, or any other federal agency from which we've received funding? And why did we run into those issues? Let's implement a plan and develop a strategy that avoids those potholes, because we see them coming. We know what our shortfalls are. We know where we may have challenges, whether that's documentation or procurement or cost tracking, and build into your plans specific strategies to avoid those pitfalls. So let's keep moving down the road here. We're going to talk about again what programs your county generally participates in. I think I'm actually doubling down on my last slide here. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one and talk about planning. So Mark mentioned blue sky planning. Right now we're all in the grips of the COVID-19 disaster. We're all probably going through the PA program, the CARES Act, and ARPA all at the same time. And I don't think anybody was ready for it. When we first heard about it, geez, it seems like 2 years ago. I'm not sure that any of us thought it would have evolved to the magnitude that it has today, but it has. So I think as a county, as a county that serves that's responsible for their community, taking advantage of all of these different funding programs is really, really important to support your healthcare needs, or your law enforcement needs, or your infrastructure needs, to not only respond to the event at hand, but to also make your community more resilient in the future. So we do that by suggesting that we do blue sky planning when we're not in the grips of a disaster. Obviously, we can't plan on the weather. We can't plan on the next random virus that comes out of nowhere and flattens all of our economies and everything else. But we can take the time when we're not in the grips of a disaster like this to perform some blue sky planning and really bring all of the stakeholders together within your community to develop the strategy and then develop individualized plans to support each one of the funding programs that you intend to take advantage of. So waiting until the disaster, I don't want to say it's too late, but it's certainly too late to sit down and create a plan. So I like to think of this in two different ways. We have our standard grants management plan that we use time and time again. And no matter what happens, we have a process in place. We've identified our key stakeholders, our departmental leads. We've identified our cost tracking mechanisms and all the things that we're going to do to support any grant that we happen to apply for. But I also think it's important to create an ad hoc grant management strategy. So next time we have a pandemic event, we have a plan that might be flexible enough for us to say, hey, you know what, we've done this before. It's just, it looks a little different. We have to navigate the new regulation and the new interim federal rule or whatever it may be. But in terms of a general grants management, you know what you're doing. But you're also prepared for those events that may not fit the mold. So, to Mark's point, creating a flexible grants management strategy becomes really, really important. And by doing that, it allows for really a lot more informed decision making. So you know exactly what the implications are of your decisions, and it makes spending plans, making spending decisions easier. I know ARPA, one of the biggest components of ARPA is creating that spending plan. And if you have a recovery roadmap, you've developed your funding matrix, you know exactly what you're already tapping into through the grant programs that you're used to participating in. And so you've identified by doing that, incidentally, where your gaps might be, thus informing a more thorough spending plan and helping your community recover a lot quicker. So how do we map a grants management plan? Well, this is one example. We're going to go through this, sort of step by step. This is really, a good disaster, but I'm going to try to make it a bit more innocuous and less specific. So again, creating a decision-making process, developing that funding matrix so that you know which programs you're taking advantage of is really, really important. But first and foremost, let's determine your needs. And if it's a disaster event, let's determine what your losses are. When we talk about grants management, it may not always be about a loss. It may be about a need. So maybe we're talking about building a more resilient community through tapping into the HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and building a levee or elevating critical communications equipment to enhance your emergency services ability to respond to the community. So what are your community's needs? And based on that, it will inform your organization as to what programs you might want to participate in. And maybe we developed a plan this year and we're ready for the hazard mitigation program next year. Creating a really solid plan allows you to participate in these programs regularly. Oftentimes, I'm sorry, I see a question here, just to make sure I don't want to, okay. Oftentimes, a lot of our clients have a regular process where they apply for and take advantage of these programs. So a good example is my time in Arkansas. I spent a lot of my time supporting some of the smaller towns and counties out there. And they get hit by floods, sometimes multiple times a year. And oftentimes when FEMA shows up, they're ready to go. They've got their project worksheets. The FEMA basically doesn't have any job to do except to go lay eyes on the damaged facilities. But the county will hand us the project and say, here you go. We're ready to go. We do this 3 times a year. That may be the case, but it's also important to develop a program, a plan that can support any program. So, Once we've determined what your community needs are, we've determined what programs you might want to participate in, whether that's HMGP, FHWA, or DHS. We categorize our losses and potential investments of funds within your community. So how can we best spend this money throughout the community based on what those community needs are? We want to determine the eligibility of your potential project. So based on your needs, based on what your community needs and how you'd like to invest in your community, what are the various eligibility criterion for all of the programs that you would like to or currently participate in? And let's look at how those plans, how those potential projects might fit into those various programs. And then we develop a strategy, which includes an idea as to how you might support these programs from an administrative standpoint. The reason FEMA has, what used to be called the direct administrative cost policy, now called the management cost policy, is because they know that these programs are challenging. They take a lot of time, and they've got a really, really long timeline on them, and they take a lot of effort and cost these organizations a lot of money to manage. So thinking about how you'll manage the program from an administrative standpoint is really, really important. And sometimes that may be, capitalizing on your current resources. Do we have a software solution in place that works for grants management? Do we have a grants management team, and do we need to do regular training, or do we have to, use folks who would normally be doing other jobs but cross-train them in grants management? Or do we need a consultant, or do we need to hire, temporary folks to help support our grants management process? So that's, just another thing to consider. So, and then next we'd like to suggest developing a funding approach. So it's a strategy for applying for and utilizing funds to work in concert with one another to avoid duplication, but to cover the gaps at the same time. So again, we're going to go back to that funding matrix. When we look at, and I'll give you an example of actually how we've used this recently. One of our larger healthcare clients out here in California, they're participating in the Provider Relief Fund. They're participating in hazard mitigation program, in FEMA's PA program, and now ARPA, and they want to know how do we make this money work together. And, I think we talked about this during the last webinar that we had. Sometimes the path of least resistance becomes our decision-making criteria, because in this COVID environment, it's been really difficult to meet ARPA and CARES Act timelines while FEMA considers the eligibility of what our clients are asking for from them. So, taking a holistic, top level look at the programs you're participating in, what the path of least resistance is, and how those different programs may overlap with one another, and where the gaps might be, really helps inform a thorough grants management plan. And then last but not least, preparing for closeout from the onset is paramount. Turnover and administrative timelines on closeouts affect ability to close grants with ease. So again, I'm going to give that example of the Northridge earthquake. 17 years passed since the disaster happened, and when we finally closed that disaster out back when I was with FEMA. And I would imagine that there are scarcely anyone within the communities that we were serving that was there in the county or city or local government administration by the time we got around to closing those projects out. And when I say got around to, I mean that because FEMA is completely overwhelmed at the moment. I mean, think of the number of projects they're going to have to close out from this COVID-19 disaster. Tens of thousands, literally every applicant in the country is eligible. And I would suspect that almost all of them are going to have a project for FEMA. So, while we had 17 years between the onset and the closure of the Northridge earthquake, we'll most likely see it, at least 10, maybe 20 years before FEMA finally gets around to closing these projects out. Now, with a really thorough grants management plan, it allows you to, you've got your cost tracking mechanisms in place, you've got your documentation mechanisms in place, you've monitored the work, you've met your timelines, you've followed all the regulations, your procurement's good, and at the end of the day, you've stored everything in a nice, clean package in a good location that's secure. You can request closeout anytime you want. So you send your letter to the state and say, hey, I want to close my projects out now and reconcile, the funds that I've received now, so we can put this behind us and be prepared for the next one. That's also an option. So, by having a really good thorough grants management plan in place, it really allows you to, to get through this faster. Your community recovers quickly. You're less likely to be challenged with any of those potential pitfalls and disallowances that we talked about. And just all in all, it helps your community recover, which is the end goal here. So we're going to go over just I'm sorry, Mark, I see you've got a question here.
Just one thing. So I just wanted to add, so, Alan mentioned one of the advantages, be able to begin that closeout potentially earlier if you have all that information available and it's ready to be worked through. So the other advantage of that is, the IG's timeline to specifically go back and review things has a beginning and an end. And the timer on that typically starts when the grant is officially closed out, when that closeout is completed. So if you have no other reason not to close out, it's simply to start that clock a little sooner, in regards to how quickly some other third party is allowed to come and review the documentation. So if they don't get to it in their timeline, there are court rulings, and since legal precedent been adopted by most of the agencies, that won't have any teeth to any IG reports issued after that timeline has expired. So good advice. That's all. I just wanted to add that in. Thanks, Ed.
No, really good point, Mark. I appreciate that. I should have spent more time on those particular timelines, because that predicates how long we stored the documentation and what you might build into your grants management strategy with that respect. We did get a couple of questions, but before I get to those, I just wanted to show you guys this last slide here. We've got a handful of resources for you all. We've got our internal, grants management overview, and a handful of other resources for you. We'll be providing this document. NACo will be sending it to all of the participants today, so you'll have these resources at your disposal. And if you're okay with it, Mark, I'll go ahead and jump questions that I see. I only see two so far, but I think now's the time if we can documentation strategy. So are there templates available for the documentation strategies? I don't think there's any one solution fits all organizations out there. I don't think there's just one solution that might work for every county on this call. But we have, Tidal Basin, we do employ some templates that we use for all of our clients. So I would say that yes, absolutely, in terms of a structure for storing documentation. And then one level down, we like to create templates that support each individual grant program. That way we have uniform data that, when we submit this stuff to, to FEMA or HUD or, CDB, whoever it may be, when they look at the data, they're used to, they know what format it's going to come in. So they may have 100 projects, but they all look exactly the same and they're supported with the same, in the same format. But I think it's really important to really support
You froze up.
what you're asking here, to look not necessarily. Oh, am I back, Mark?
You're back.
Okay, sorry about that. For some reason, my internet has been tough today. So what I was saying is my suggestion is that we look at the most complex of the programs you intend to participate in, and create templates based on the documentation necessary to support that one particular program, because the likelihood of that more complex program requiring less documentation than any of these other programs is pretty low. So if we're looking at supporting the PA program, it's with a certain level of documentation using a template, it's more than likely going to support the majority of other grant programs as well. The other question we have here is, it's really a request. So please elaborate on your understanding of the FEMA PA continued guidance language related to FEMA determining more appropriate funding sources for certain COVID-19 expenses, and how that affects COVID-19 funding decisions for the Treasury, ARPA, CSL, FRF. Is FEMA PA a safe source of final reimbursement over a recipient's allocation under Treasury, CSF, or CSL, FRF? That's a very layered question. And Mark, please jump in here, but I'm going to give it a crack. I'll start with the is FEMA safe question. Actually, I'll start one level up. So, FEMA likes to refer to the PA program as the payer of last resort. So after all other external funding sources, whether that's grants, donations, insurance, or otherwise, FEMA considers the PA program to be a last resort resource. So consider that. Now, with the PA program as it relates to ARPA and the CARES Act, it's been a little bit of a back and forth. And the issue is that there's a lot of different ways you can spend ARPA and CARES Act money. And I know you didn't specify CARES Act here, but there's a bunch of different ways you can spend that money that would otherwise not be eligible under the PA program. So when we talk about maximizing your opportunity by creating that funding matrix, that's what we mean. We're talking about lining up what you can spend ARPA on against what you can or can't spend PA on, and looking at where you can create efficiencies. So, for example, there are many things you can do with ARPA that are less related directly to the COVID-19 disaster. Most recently, we were asked a question about whether or not you could buy robots and drones to support law enforcement. And maybe some technological solutions to enhance the safety of your community. I can tell you right off the bat that FEMA PA for the COVID disaster would absolutely not allow those types of expenses. Maybe there's some room for those types of expenses under ARPA. So whether or not it's safe, really is predicated on FEMA's ability to get to these reviews and issue determinations, which we've run into challenges on. That's why it's important to consider what are the eligibility criteria, what are we absolutely certain of that we can get from the PA program, and what should we seek under ARPA, whether that's lost revenue because we can't get that out of the PA program, or whether that's some resiliency measures that we want to incorporate into our communities. I can kind of read between the lines here. The PA program has been very difficult to get funding out of. So, I like to look at ARPA and CARES first, because that also informs how you intend to take advantage of the ARPA program.
So just to add to Alan's response a little bit, so right, so part of FEMA's being the funder of last resort, right, is really based and predicated on the sections in the Stafford Act that refer to duplication of benefits, right? So they can't pay for legally anything that a community is being reimbursed for with insurance, right? Or where there's some other congressional program that was specifically set up to address. So as an example, and I'm just going to put this out there, historically, HUD had a program for which they would essentially fund repairs of publicly owned housing units across the United States. And essentially, it, besides running their normal budget stuff, it was also the vehicle for funding if there were catastrophic levels of damage to those facilities based on some kind of a disaster. But it required Congress to especially put funding into it. And so there were many years that Congress didn't put money into it. And so as a result, HUD would say, we have no money to spend on it. FEMA would consider the eligibility, said, hey, well, it's not a duplication if nobody else is paying for it. It ultimately is something we might need to consider, but then they took a hard line on it right about the time of Katrina. And so as a result, to resolve that, Congress went in, worked with HUD, changed the way the authority is written for that particular fund so that it cannot cover those types of expenses, and cleared the way for FEMA to continue paying that funding. So, one of the things that I think, just the reason I bring up that example is specific to like the types of funding that's out there. So FEMA may be able to tell you that there was another line of funding that you might have been able or willing to consider if it was very specifically and only available for the thing that you're asking them for. But if you had funding that was available and allowed to be programmed by you for a wide variety of needs, and your community fully expended that funding on other things you needed and didn't provide the funding for the thing that could also be eligible under FEMA, it makes a very strong argument to FEMA that there was no other funding source that was specifically available for that, because it was it was also meant for other things, and you used it in the spirit in which it was intended, as opposed to not using it and returning it. So, I think that's where one of the factors comes in as to how FEMA will evaluate that. So just putting that on the table for you to consider. Okay. Thanks, Steve. I'm glad we covered it somewhat for you. And I think we have a little bit more time if there are any other questions. Okay, not seeing any. Well, I guess, I don't know if, Alan, I know that everything from this presentation, I believe the recording of the presentation, as well as Q&As, whether that they're those that we've answered here in the session or those that might get submitted or somehow come into the chat after we've closed the chat, we'll do our best to make sure that there are good and solid answers provided to those. They'll be available both through NACo as well as on the Tidal Basin site. And very much appreciate everybody's participation today. So enjoyed the opportunity to get to cover the topic with you. I know it's a challenging one and there's so much more we could talk about. So, I would expect that some of you have very nuanced questions or things you want to discuss, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alan. I want to say a big thank you to our partners at Tidal Basin. And yes, if you have other questions, you can certainly feel free to submit those to myself or Alana Hurley, who you probably received emails from as you registered for this webinar. We will post the recording. We will post the slides. And Mark and Alan, I'm sure you will receive more. And as you said, Mark, in-depth questions from us and our members going forward. So with that, thank you so much again for joining. Mark and Alan, thanks for your presentation and information, and we look forward to talking to everybody soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.